father starting your company, please? And can I please ask our club members to turn off their audio, leave your video on, and please listen to our guest speaker, Glenn.
Ross, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having me tonight. It's quite an unusual opportunity to sort of talk in this sort of forum. It's definitely a first for me when Ross was stepping me through it this morning to be able to sit in front of my PC and actually have a conversation with people all over Australia, which is and the world. I'm guessing we've got a guest from the States tonight as well. So thank you for joining me and my wife's study at home here to tell you about our family business, which is Adina Watches. My dad started our business 46 years ago. We're Australia's last manufacturers of watches. So what that really means is we outsource all over the world to the world's best component makers. We bring each of those components into our factory here in Brisbane, and we combine those components into finished product of a watch, and then we have a retail network of about 400 stores nationally that are selling our product. Over the past 46 years, we've grown from my dad sitting in my family home. He would make the watches of a night time and then go out and sell them during the daytime. And that's probably the best place to start is about our story is at the start. Dad is a watchmaker by trade. He did his apprenticeship here in Brisbane to a family that now own called Langfords, that now own the Rolex dealership for Queensland. So he was trained as a Rolex type watchmaker and had a good foundation of premium watches. My grandfather was the distributor of Rolexes in those days, and back in that sort of era, there was a number of wholesaling houses, and they would sell a whole host of different product and go from country town to country town, or usually regional area to regional area, and city to city selling. But that's not what I talk. I've got lots of stories, and if Archie was still alive now, he'd have loads more stories than me. But back to my dad, when he came out of his apprenticeship, he stayed working in the shop that he was working in, and one of his mates, sort of 10 years on, sort of said to him, "Where do you sort of see yourself going with this whole watchmaking thing?" He was an importer, and he suggested to Dad to go to Switzerland and perhaps buy a watch, and you could just stamp our name on it, and then we could start sort of selling it. On the way to Switzerland for this initial meeting in 1971, Mum was pregnant with me, and so he stopped into a box maker in Bangkok, and this box making factory also had some other elements to it. They actually made watch cases and watch dials. So when we talk about components, it would be made up of a number of different ones. You've got the case, obviously the outside of the watch, the dial, the hands, the crown, which some people call the winder, the glass, the movement that drives the watch, and obviously the bracelet that the watch hangs the watch to your wrist. So this factory made two of those components. So there's a really flamboyant Swiss guy working in this factory at that particular time, and what he wanted to do was talk Dad into actually producing his own watch. So Dad said, "I don't know if that's for me, but I'll have a think about it." Flew on to Switzerland to the World Watch Fair, where he met a few different people, and one guy actually we did business with for about 30 odd years from that initial meeting. He flew back from Switzerland, back via Bangkok to buy the boxes, and once again he thought about it, and he said to this guy, "How many cases do I need to buy?" And he said, 100. He goes, 100 cases? What am I going to do with 100 cases? So he said, all right, well, if I go one step further, and this guy was really not pushy, but he was very encouraging. So, "Dad, you're really entrepreneur. Bob, you're really entrepreneurial. You can do it, you know." So Dad designed 5 different dials to go in this particular case. It was the 70s, so he designed red, green, black, white, some out there sorts of things. Brought them home, put them together over night time, and then went out, as I said earlier, and sold them. They sold like crazy. So he was off and running, and that was the initial capital that got the business going. Originally, the watches were called Rolmer, which is our company name. There was a Swiss company called Ulmer back in those days, and they said, "It's a little bit close to our name, so we'd like you to either pay us 10 grand or you can change it." So Dad once again thought, well, 10 grand in 1972-ish hell of a lot of money. It's a hell of a lot of money now if you don't have it. So what he thought was, I'll come up with a new name. Once again, was coming back from Switzerland in sort of 2 years' time. He was reading the Reader's Digest on the plane, and there was a story about Australian Aborigines. And there were a few dialect words in there, and one of those was Adina. And he thought, that is the perfect name for my watch. Nice and short, nice and balanced. And so from 1973, our watches changed from being Rolmer to becoming Adina. That was a period of a lot of growth for us into the 80s, which were good years, and then the late 80s, which were quite a struggle. I joined the business in 1995. I had to think about it then. Now we're talking 2000s all the time. I joined the business in 1995. My background was hospitality. Dad had never really ever asked me to sort of come into the organisation before. He'd always let me do my own thing. I'd work for Sheraton, I'd run nightclubs, I'd travel all over the world. I'd come home and he said, well, what are you going to do now? And I said, I'm going to be a rep. And he said, righto. He said, well, why don't you come and be a rep for me? I said, well, what's a rep really do? And he said, well, it's two things you love doing. You love talking to people and you love traveling. So with that, I sort of said, well, sounds like a good idea. He said, well, don't muck me around. If you're coming in, you're coming in. I need you to be fair income. He said, there's lots of sons and daughters joining their mums and dads' businesses now, because the strongest part of our business network is our network of 400 retailers. So he saw an opportunity for me to engage in that retail space with those 400 odd retailers, many of them having sons and daughters. So in that time though, we only had about 80 retailers. So I said, yeah, righto. So he trained me on how to sort of sell the watches, and I sort of knew what I thought was about them. But it is quite amazing how what you perceive your business is, that's put food on your table as a child all your life, and what your business really is, are two very, very different things. And I'll never forget, on my first repping trip, I went into northern New South Wales and I ended up in Moree. And that client there is now a very, very good customer of ours, and he's a very good friend of mine now. And I walked into his shop, guy same age as me, and I looked in his counter and he had 6 Adina watches left in his counter. And I said, it looks like I've arrived at the right time. You've only got 6 watches left. And he looked at me and he said, that's all I carry. And I was just shattered. I couldn't believe that, he would only be carrying 6 watches. I thought everybody had these massive ranges of watches, and which I learnt very, very quickly was not the case. So I thought, well, this is a challenge for me. I've got to start growing everybody's ranges in their stores. So I went store to store to store to store to store until I hit water, which was in Melbourne. And I turned right, Forrest Gump style, and I kept going sort of west until I got to Adelaide. And 10 years later, after 36 weeks away on the road every day, we'd grown by about 4 or 5 times and had another few fellas helping us. These days, we've got 12 watchmakers on the bench. We're producing about 40,000 watches annually out of our workshop in Brisbane. As I said earlier, we're the last producers of watches of any sort of volume. There are some sort of kitschy, like solid gold guys that are jewelers that might make 1 or 2 watches a year. But for anything of any production, we're the last Australian guys. As I said, we've got 2 apprentices that we're learning the trade, because, as you can probably appreciate, there's not a lot of watchmakers around. Ross, being from down Lismore way, he's probably blessed with one of the last towns that's got a swag of them right there, and all really good ones. So we're lucky to engage in that space with those fellas down there. But watchmaking is a dying trade, so we've taken it upon ourselves, as you can see by the first image on the screen, to actually have watchmakers in our workshop. Our workshop itself is divided into 2 main areas, or 2 very distinct areas. On the one side, you've got production. On the other side, you've got repairs. After 46 years of producing watches, there's a hell of a lot of our watches out around Australia and New Zealand and the world, for that matter. We just actually did up a watch for an American guy who came out to Australia in 2000 with his daughter for the Olympics. Ended up buying one of our dive watches to go out swimming on the Great Barrier Reef. Has absolutely loved it ever since. It needed a bit of a zhuzhing up and a refurb, he sent it out from the States. We only just finished it today, so I'm really keen to hear his feedback. But in saying that, the photo that you can see there is our repair workshop. We've got a number of watchmakers out there that are handling all our repairs. But repairs aren't just fixing the watches. We've also got to have the parts. And being a producer, and I think this is what catches a lot of people out. Most people, there's a lot of brands that just start from nothing and think, well, you know what, I'm going to get myself a watch brand. They don't take into account all that after-sale service that goes on behind the scenes. Because watches, and I don't really know how to put my finger exactly on it, but watches have this powerful intrinsic value. We're definitely the poor cousins in any jewellery store overall, but what we do is we have a very powerful link from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, and vice versa, daughters to mothers, sons to mums, sons to dads. We just produced a watch for one of the private schools up here in Brisbane for the 100-year anniversary of the Churchy Old Boys. And what we've found is that people have been buying this premium timepiece so that they've got something that they can hand on to their sons and their sons that are all churchy guys, such as the nature of the community of that particular school. So watches, although we're challenged in the modern era by not only all your fashion watches, now all your Fitbits, smart watches, etc., but everyone says, aren't phones killing you off? The interesting thing about the phones, I was interviewed probably 12 months ago now by a journo from The Age, and she rang the office, and you could smell the story that she was after. The iPhone and iWatch killed the last Australian watchmaker. And I said to this lady, I said, have you got a watch that you own that you really love? And she says to me, yeah, my mum and dad gave me this watch for my 21st. It's been so much to me. I probably don't wear it as much as I should, but, da-da-da-da-da. And I said to her, do you reckon we're going broke? And she said, I hadn't thought of it like that. And then a whole different conversation ensued about the intrinsic value of watches and how powerful they are to remind people of people that have passed on, or of memories like this gentleman in the States of swimming on the Great Barrier Reef. So that said, the other part of our organisation is our production. And as I said, we're producing about 40,000 watches annually. I've not an image of that part of my workshop, but that's the watch that we made for the school. So one of the guys who bought it is in London, and he chose to send that. But the production side of things is there's some guys, some shooting clubs. We get heavily involved in our community. But the production side, it has another 5 guys that work on that, and it controls the whole quality, and that's where my dad spends most of his time, in the QC area, making sure that the standard he set 46 years ago is maintained. It's not just our watches that are important and that we're really proud of. It's the ability to make a watch that goes out into the marketplace and has the ability to be repaired and to be loved and not let our customers down. Now, that's not to say we never have problems. My goodness. A few years ago, we had an awful problem. We couldn't, with our probably combined, at least between 300 and 500 years of watchmaking experience in our workshops, for the life of us, find what was going on with these gents' watches. We tested for magnetism. We did every test known to man that we could possibly think of. And there was a watchmaker in Murwillumbah on the Queensland-New South Wales border. He suggested to me when I was in the store, he said, mate, sometimes these circuits are a little bit dicey when the batteries are a bit funny. And sure enough, Energizer had changed the format for their watch batteries, and it was causing trouble with the Swiss movements that we used. And that could have, if we'd let it go probably another year, could have spent the end of our business. It was becoming that much of a problem. So we've had our share of ups and downs for sure, but we've always, through our relationship and our watchmaking prowess, been able to sort of overcome those, which sort of leads us now into this modern space of not only have we got now engaging with our retail network of 400 retailers, but we've also had to embrace having an online store. The online store was at first, Dad was really, really nervous about it, and I certainly suggested strongly to him that it was the future and we needed to embrace it. I certainly didn't want to become the next Blockbuster or Kodak, and be a punchline at a trade fair. The people talk about Bob and Grant, those nice guys from Queensland, and say what was the name of their watches as they're having a beer. We had too much. We had too much to play for, so we changed our strategy, and that online strategy has now become quite strong, and that's given us the ability to sort of reach out more and more into the media, which has led us to be a little bit of the belle of the ball, I guess, at the moment. And as Ross saw, there was a nice article about us in the Virgin Press on the airline. So with that sort of media attention on the brand, we've been able to once again then start embracing some corporates, which is where I envisage the company to have our next sort of really strong area of growth, engaging with schools and universities and our corporates, of which we have a number already for years of service, and also safety awards. We've done it. We're working with the mines. We make a specialist mining watch. So we're really trying to niche ourselves in the marketplace to ensure that our longevity for the next 46 years. But I think is that my 20 there, Ross? Or is that a good? Is that enough snapshot into my day-to-day world?
Yeah, thank you so much, Grant. That's been really good. Grant, are you happy to sort of take some questions now?
Oh, please do. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Grant, what might pay is to unshare your screen now, please, if you would. And that'll open up some more screen space for us and our members.
Yeah.
And do we have some questions, please, for Grant?
Yeah, I was that interesting. Everybody's is shell shocked.
Graham, I've got a question for you in relation to, you mentioned about using batteries.
Mm-hmm.
What about winding gear and things like this? Obviously, you've got two types of watches. I'm not familiar with your watches, unfortunately. I've still got one here which I've had a few years. So, how do you come about with the two different watches?
So there's two ways to power a watch. Oh, there's more than two ways, but the two ways that we use, we follow the Swiss way of doing things, and in that you've got the quartz operated, battery operated watches, which are called quartz, and we use them in probably about 90% of the watches that we produce. But then we also use mechanical, two types. Like we make wind up pocket watches, predominantly for the presentation space. We've got a large corporate that uses a pocket watch that we designed for them for their 40 years of service, and it's a traditional hand wind. The way that sort of watch works is as you actually wind it, you tighten the spring, and as that spring wants to undo, that's the energy to power the watch. If you want to put it into a wristwatch, what you can use is automatic, and automatic is where instead of hand winding the watch, you actually have a weight inside the movement which swings from side to side as you're moving your hands or going about your, and that's what powers the watch. We tend to use that style of movement specifically in our mining watches, so all our underground stuff is all made with mechanical. All the coal underground miners are no longer able to use battery operated watches underground. So one of my clients up in Mackay suggested strongly to us that we get involved in this market. We built from the ground up a model that we felt was fairly bulletproof for these guys and girls that are going underground. And I can tell you, we've seen some watches come back through the workshop that look like they've been in a war. And I didn't realise that the face of a coal mine, as they're cutting the coal away, they're actually using acid. And so they're using a lot of protective gear, but the watches they wear on the outside. So these shiny watches come back and look like they're absolutely sandblasted. But we use sapphire glasses, and so that it's very, very difficult for them to scratch. And it's not to say that you can't kill one of our watches, but it takes some doing. So hence why we've developed such a strong following in that mining sector, because they pay a little bit more for our stuff, but it's we feel we've always prescribed to you get what you pay for, and we've never sacrificed quality for price, and that's why my dad still sits in the number one quality control chair at our place, and because that standard that he set from day one is maintained throughout the entire collection. But in that automatic space, we an interesting side story is this year just randomly met an Irish mountaineer that came into my workshop, introduced by a mate. He said, I climbed Everest 2 years ago. I'm heading back to the Himalayas. We're taking 2 teams, one going up Everest, one going up Lhotse. Lhotse is the 4th highest mountain in the world, and they sit next door to each other. Everest is here, Lhotse is there. Camp free for both mountains is the same, and then they split to go. Anyway, we just started talking about this and that, and I said, would you take one of my watches to the top? And he's like, yeah, sure, mate. You know, Irish guys, yeah, sure, mate, we'll do that for you. Da, 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 da. And he just wanted to do it because we got along. There was no money going to change hands. I was going to obviously give him the watches. So myself and our team, I'm not a watchmaker by trade, but you know, we put our heads together and how we were going to come up with a watch that was going to go up into the death zone and go through, you know, 40 degrees below, etc., and extreme temperatures and winds, and being worn on the outside of the person. And so we stripped the Swiss automatic movement back to the bare bones. We chatted to an oil maker in Switzerland to find out a cocktail of oils that we could use to lubricate the watch so it wouldn't freeze up when it was getting this cold. A lot of the battery operated stuff that the guys take up there, I didn't know this, but they have to sleep with their cameras to keep the batteries warm so that they can operate their GoPros, etc., to get the footage. And they even said, like, some of the altimeter watches that they wear up freeze up so they can't be used. So this is a huge challenge for us. And you know, at my workshop, I've got this little sign that Kian used when he got to the top, and he sits there with the Adina with this watch on, and he, you know, we had to even cut down a piece of seatbelt and sew these buckles into it to get this really long band to go over this big puffy suit that he wore. You know, so it was pretty awesome when he came back down, and I was sort of flying, and he came into the office. And he lost like 20 kilos. He was this emancipated man. But, you know, I was so proud of, you know, being part of that journey with him. And that watch means a lot to him now personally. And, you know, we call it the Thin Air. So watch this space in your local retailer for the Adina Thin Air. But, you know, that's where we sort of get our kicks, I guess, in a way. It's we're very, very proud of the watches that we produce, and to get involved with expeditions like that. You know, we're no Rolex, but and he's not Sir Edmund Hillary, but he stood on that same ground and he stood up there with one of our watches. So yeah, it makes me super proud that we were a part of it. But that was a mechanical watch. So does that answer your question about the 2 different sort of movements that we use?
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, good.
That's good.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks, guys. Any other questions, please?
Heather would like to ask a question. Have you got pretty ones that have diamantes around them for women?
Absolutely, Heather. We're like in the 70s when we were Dad was getting the business going. In those days, there was a lot of guys coming home from the Vietnam War, and a lot of those guys were taking their R&R through Japan, coming back with a lot of watches and going and selling them to their local retailers in Gladstone, Townsville, Mackay, wherever. So we couldn't, in those days, we couldn't give a gent's watch away. So Dad thought, well, what sort of niche can we come up with that is going to find its way into the Australian psyche? And it was actually waterproof watches for women. So we have a range of our watches called Oceaneer. So he thought, well, if Australian girls like to go swimming and they're tough on things as well, so I'm going to use my training from my Rolex days into making a waterproof watch for ladies. Go fast forward now, the thick end of 40 odd years, we now make pretty much the only range of really functional fashion watches. We saw the market was changing, and that women were looking for something that they wanted to wear every day, but they wanted it to look really good too, you know. So we've incorporated that pedigree or expertise in what we have in making waterproof watches into combining that into a watch that looks flash, with some with diamantes, some with not. But you know, we pride ourselves on wearing something from the boardroom to the beach, or from a cocktail party to having kids spew all over your hand, if that's the case, you know. So our watches, we like to think, are pretty practical, but they look great as well. And there's a lot of watchmaking sort of thought goes into making things, you know, especially from a diamante point of view. A lot of the girls knock the diamonds or knock the Swarovski crystals out of them. So what we do is we set a nice little bezel around them to protect them a little bit more, because you know, some of the girls can be quite hard on things. So we've got to keep thinking, how can we make this watch that little bit better, that's going to last that little bit longer, so as to continue our reputation of having, great looking, but great lasting and great performing watches.
Thank you.
No worries, Heather. It's a nice spot, Exmouth, isn't it?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Half your luck.
Okay, guys. Well, look, Grant, on the strength of that, we might just end things there. That doesn't mean to say that you won't see some chat coming up with other questions, perhaps. Grant, a special thanks to you for coming along this evening and speaking to the club. And I've really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I love watches. I have 5 of them. None of them are Adina. I'm going to have to do something about that, aren't I?
Mate, I can strongly insist that you should, you know?
Well, I work in casino, and that's where I am this evening. And we do have one of Grant's suppliers here in a local jeweler, and I've noticed that he's got more than 6